Welcome to the Daily Word Verse by Verse. Grab your Bibles and follow along as we study the book of Romans. Keep in mind, I am using the Holman Christian Standard Bible. So if you're using a different translation, the read is different, but the message is the same. Also, these Daily Word Verse by Verse studies are uploaded to my YouTube channel, BP, the Bible Perspective. That's BP, the Bible Perspective. So you can get all of these studies, catch up on the verse by verse studies through the entire Bible as we are moving along through the Bible. Okay, Romans chapter 11, verse 1 says, I ask then, has God rejected his people? Now, remember, since chapter 9, Paul has been talking about why Israel is not being saved. But he's going to really clarify some things today. He's going to bring a lot of things together in this chapter. But remember, the number one reason why Israel is not saved is because they haven't submitted themselves to the righteousness of God. The salvation plan that God had set forth, they rejected. Plain and simple. So yes, I ask then, has God rejected his people? Absolutely not. For I, too, am an Israelite, a descendant from Abraham, from the tribe of Benjamin. So he clarifies something here. Now, by the way, keep in mind that he is referring to the nation of Israel versus individual. What Paul had just brought out here was that the gospel is to the Jew and to the Gentile. Remember, he made that statement at the very beginning of the letter. Okay? But now he's dealing with the nation of Israel, why the nation itself is not saved. So he kind of shifts and says, well, what God is doing right now is individually those who are responding to the gospel are being saved. So in the sense that, has God rejected his people? No, his people have rejected him. In other words, here is the salvation plan that I'm offering. Well, then you can say that they rejected that. It kind of reminds me of the story of Cain and Abel. There were two sons. God did not reject Cain. Cain rejected God's way. And God's not going to budge. By the way, God never budges. God is God. He doesn't have to budge. Our thing as creation is to submit to God. Okay? But Cain rejected God. Thus, he was rejected. Yes. Now, the nation of Israel. And by the way, when did this? I'm jumping ahead here. Let me move on, because there's some points I want to make from this, because this is also an important reason or intersection here. Why is Israel so important? And it's, of course, for the last two chapters, it has been heavy on Paul's heart that he's been expressing this. So why is Israel so important? Why is this issue so important to Paul? Why is this issue so important to God? Let me kind of bring something in here. If we go back to creation, God creates the earth, puts Adam on the earth. Adam sins, thus alienating mankind and creation from the life of God. So from Genesis chapter 3, the main plot line has been the redemption of man, God redeeming mankind. But then you have a few subplots. So you got the main plots, and then you got a few subplots that's going on. And one of those, I'm going to call it this, main subplots is God's plan and purpose for Israel. Now, as we've read in chapter 9 and chapter 10, and also chapter 3, you remember, what is the advantage of the Jew? Why is it important for the Jew? Well, because let me read it again, because I think it's important. And by the way, throughout history, for some reason, even there have been Christians who hated the Jews, which is amazing to me. One of the great church fathers hated the Jews. So that is always amazing. That kind of shows you're not reading this scripture. All right, so in chapter 3, verse 1, again, he says, so what advantage does the Jew have, or what is the benefit of circumcision? Considerably in every way. First, they were entrusted with the spoken words of God. So understand that. I'm gonna read this because this next verse also is going to have it's what Paul is talking about in chapter 11. He says, verse 3, what then if some did not believe? Will their unbelief cancel God's faithfulness? Absolutely not. God must be true and every man a liar. So remember that statement in context to chapter 3. Now, in chapter 9, you'll remember he says, chapter 9, he says, verse 4, talking about Israel, they are the Israelites to whom belong the adoption, the glory, the covenants, the giving of the law, temple service, the promise, the forefathers, and from them by physical descent came the Messiah, who is God over all, blessed forever. So those are the benefits of Israel. This is why God is using Israel. This is their purpose. Through them, the law came, Christ came. Okay? So it's important. We also need to understand what are the prophetic promises that God has laid out for Israel. Now, if you really want to understand, then this, because we're not doing it here as an exhaustive study, but I want to just kind of just show you from the Old Testament, the prophetic books, that if you want to understand God's plan and then what is the prophetic promises, because from the beginning God made specific promises. Now to date we haven't seen those fulfilled. But if you want to read, I'm just going to read. And what happened, by the way, about a couple of hundred years before the Babylonian exile, God began to prophesy. And that prophetic voice began with Isaiah. Now, also, what is known as the minor prophets, and this is a theological thing, and the reason why is because that's how they arranged it in most of our English Bibles. But if you want to arrange them to me more from a timely perspective, the majority of the minor prophets fit around the same prophetic time as Isaiah. So Isaiah, you look at the book of Isaiah, and then you look at Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, and Zephaniah. Those books were a prophetic voice around the same time as Isaiah. And what that prophetic voice was, God was beginning to speak of the upcoming doom of Israel, but he would also speak of the glorious future that they had. Now, after that prophetic period of time, you had Jeremiah, Lamentations, Ezekiel, Daniel. Ezekiel and Daniel were counterparts. Now, after, and this is, by the way, Jeremiah was prophecy doing the actual destruction of Israel. He was there doing the destruction of the temple, Jerusalem. Ezekiel and Daniel were exiled. Daniel was taken away. Ezekiel, they were both in Babylon at the time of the prophecy. After the Babylonian exile, then you had Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. Now, the reason why that's important because those are prophetic books. Those are prophetic voices prophesying. They tell of the destruction of Israel, but they also tell of the what God's plan in eternity. In other words, the nation of Israel has a prophetic place that is yet to be fulfilled. Now, that's going to be very important to understand because today there is a lot of confusion on what is the part of Israel versus Now, the future. So, like, for example, today, people will say, look at the nation of Israel today. Well, there's no prophetic kind of fulfillment there. In 1948, when they became a nation, that wasn't a fulfillment of prophecy. And I'll get more into that in the next video. We'll pick it up with verse 2. In the next video, I'll see you then.